His name was Kwon Ji-ho, and in a city where money was the only language that mattered, he was fluent in ways most men couldn't dream of. By 38 years old, Kwon Ji-ho had built an empire from nothing. Not from inheritance, not from luck, from blood, discipline, and a mind that never, ever stopped calculating. He was the kind of man that rooms went quiet for, not because he demanded it, because the weight of what he'd become walked in before he did. 6'2", built like a man who still trained every morning before the sun came up. Neck tattoos that told the story of a harder life, a life before the suits, before the towers, before the boardrooms. Dragons and Korean calligraphy that read, "Those who survive the fire become it." And beside him, always beside him, was her.
Jade Kwon, née Washington.
The woman they underestimated every single time. And every single time they paid for it. She was breathtaking in the way that silences a room. Rich, warm brown skin like polished mahogany in firelight. Curves that belonged in another era, a 1920s jazz club, a Harlem ballroom, somewhere the music never stopped. Her short finger wave pixie cut was always perfect, always deliberate, like everything about her. She had a mind like a steel trap wrapped in silk. She ran the financial architecture of Kwon Industries with the precision of a surgeon and the instincts of a predator. She didn't just stand beside Ji-ho's empire, she was the foundation it stood on. Together, they had built something extraordinary. A life that most people only saw from the outside, through the glass of their tower, through the pages of business magazines, through the tinted windows of the phantom that carried them through rain-slicked city streets. But something was coming. Something had been watching, planning, waiting. 3 men, 3 very dangerous, very foolish men, had decided that everything Kwon Ji-ho had built was theirs for the taking. They had no idea who they were really dealing with. They had never met Jade. This is their story, and it does not end the way they planned. Asterisk. Backhand index pointing down, follow for more AI content. Comment below, like this video, and tell us, which part of the country are you watching from? New parts dropping every week. You don't want to miss what happens next. Every empire has enemies. That is the price of power. And Kwon Ji-ho knew this better than most. What he didn't know, what no one could have predicted, was that the threat wouldn't come from a boardroom rival. It wouldn't come from a hostile takeover. It wouldn't come from a politician with an agenda or a competitor with a grudge. It would come from 3 men. 3 men with masks on their faces and hunger in their eyes and absolutely no idea what they were walking into. Their names weren't important. What was important was what they wanted. Everything. They wanted everything Ji-ho had built. The vault beneath the tower that held assets worth hundreds of millions. The accounts. The leverage. The access codes. They had done their homework, or so they thought. They had watched the tower for 63 days. They had mapped the security rotations. They had breached the outer digital firewall. They had studied Ji-ho's schedule, his route, his patterns. They were smart, methodical, dangerous. 3 extraordinarily built men, the kind of physical specimens that made people step aside on sidewalks without knowing why. Broad-chested, focused, each one bringing something different to the operation. The strategist who had run operations that had never been traced. The muscle, whose reputation preceded him in the kind of circles most people don't know exist. And the ghost, the one who could walk through a secured building like smoke through a keyhole. Together, they were formidable. Together, they had never failed. They sat in that underground bar the night before and raised their glasses to tomorrow,
To the score that would set them up for life.
to the tower, to the vault.
To Kwon Ji-ho.
None of them raised a glass to Jade. None of them even mentioned her. That was their first mistake. And in the world Jade Kwon moved through, there were no second ones. It happened on a Tuesday. The kind of Tuesday that looks exactly like every other Tuesday from the outside. Bright morning, city traffic, the phantom gliding through the streets of the financial district like it owned the road, because in many ways, it did. Ji-ho was on his way to a 9 a.m. board meeting. He had reviewed the agenda at breakfast. He had kissed Jade on the temple before he left. She had watched him go from the window the way she always did, until the car was out of sight. She didn't know why she watched a second longer than usual that morning. She would understand later. The underpass on Chungmiro Avenue was a 2-minute shortcut the security team had used 47 times. The three men knew this. They had counted. What happened in that tunnel lasted less than 4 minutes. 4 minutes to disable 2 SUVs. 4 minutes to neutralize 4 trained security personnel. 4 minutes to contain a man who, even outnumbered 3 to 1, made them earn every single second of it. Kwon Ji-ho was not a man who went quietly. The tattoos on his neck weren't decoration. They were a record. The life before the towers had not been soft. And even now, even in a Brioni suit with a cut above his eye and blood on his collar, he stood up. He always stood up. But 3 was too many, even for him. When Jade's phone rang, she was reviewing the quarterly figures for the Singapore acquisition. She answered on the first ring. 3 words from the other end. 3 words was all it took. And something in Jade Kwon, something that had been quietly coiled and waiting since the day she married into this world and learned every shadow in it, finally, fully woke up. She did not cry.
She did not panic.
She set down the quarterly report. She picked up a different phone. And she began. Here is what the 3 men did not know. They had done 63 days of surveillance on Kwon Ji-ho. They had learned his routes, his schedule, his security team's rotations. They had studied the man with impressive thoroughness. What they had not done, what it never occurred to them to do, was study his wife. Because why would they? She was the wife. Beautiful, wealthy, decorative, they assumed. A woman who attended galas and managed household staff, and maybe sat on a charity board. They were the kind of men who had looked at Jade Kwon and seen only what they chose to see. And that choice was going to cost them everything. Jade Kwon had not always been Mrs. Kwon. Before Ji-ho, before the towers and the phantom and the penthouse, there had been another life. A quieter life on the outside. A much more dangerous life beneath the surface. A decade of work that existed in no official record. Connections that lived in no database. Skills that had never been tested in anger until today. She did not call the police. She had reasons for that. Good ones. The kind of reasons that lived behind locked doors and encrypted files, and the kind of silence money and history buy. She called 7 people. Within 22 minutes of that call, a room in the penthouse that most people didn't know existed had become a fully operational command center. Within 31 minutes, she had located the van through a private camera network the 3 men had never thought to account for. They had been so focused on Ji-ho that they had left the most dangerous person in the building completely unwatched. Jade put on her tactical gear with the efficiency of someone who had done it before. She looked in the mirror. She looked like herself. Then she looked like something else entirely. She touched the earpiece in her ear, and she said one word, "Go." The warehouse smelled like old metal and broken things. Ji-ho had been in the chair for 41 minutes. He had not spoken except once, when the one called the strategist had laid out their demands in careful detail. The accounts, the access codes. 45 minutes to transmit, or the situation escalated. Ji-ho had listened to all of it. Every word. And then he had said, quietly, in the way that only men who truly don't fear you can say things, he had said, "You made a mistake. We have you in a chair," the strategist had replied. "That's not the mistake I mean," Ji-ho had said. And then he had gone quiet again. The 3 men had laughed. Because they were winning. Because the timer was counting down. Because there was no one coming. They had planned for that. The ghost heard it first. A sound that wasn't right, near the east wall. A silence that was too deliberate, right after a sound that was too brief. He turned. The door opened. And she was there, standing in the doorway with the last of the evening sky behind her like a painting. The 3 men stared, not because they were afraid. They hadn't gotten there yet. They stared because nothing in their 63 days of planning had included this. A woman in tactical gear. Here. This fast. This calm. Across the warehouse, Ji-ho looked at Jade. And he smiled. The real one. The one that was just for her. And Jade looked at Ji-ho, at the blood on his brow and the torn shirt and the chair, and her eyes said 3 things at once. "I found you. I'm going to handle this." And you are absolutely going to hear about this later. She stepped inside. The door swung closed behind her. The timer read 28:33. It was already over.
They just didn't know it yet.
That's how long it took. 8 minutes from the moment Jade stepped through that door to the moment all three men were contained. They had trained. They were formidable. They were, by any reasonable metric, dangerous men. But they had built their entire operation around a single assumption, that Kwon Ji-ho was alone in this. He had never been alone in anything. Not once in 7 years of marriage to a woman like Jade. The ghost had run, because that was his nature, to disappear when things went wrong. He had mentally mapped 3 extraction routes and had spent 41 minutes quietly selecting the best one. Jade had spent 11 minutes selecting it for him, and then she had walked around the building and stood in front of the door he chose. She had simply waited. The look on his face when he burst through that loading bay into the night air and found her standing there, alone, composed, already watching him, was a look he would carry for a very long time. Inside, Ji-ho had risen from the chair. He had straightened his torn shirt with one hand, run the other through his hair, and looked at the remaining chaos of the operation dismantling around him with the expression of a man doing quick inventory on what needed his attention next. Then he had looked at Jade, and she had looked at him, and in that 1 second, they said everything they needed to say. Then they turned back to the room. When it was over, the 3 men sat against the warehouse wall, enormous, handsome, completely beaten, and looked up at the couple who had just methodically disassembled 6 months of their planning in under 8 minutes. Ji-ho picked up the timer.
Stopped it.
Jade looked at the 3 men for a long moment, and then she said, very quietly, in a voice that carried to every corner of that cavernous space, "You spent 63 days studying him. Not once did you think to study me. That is why you're sitting on that floor right now." She let it sit in the air. That will be your only explanation. The handoff was clean. It always was, when Jade made the calls. The 3 men were processed by people who existed in categories most citizens didn't have clearance to know about. Whatever came next for them happened quietly and completely out of sight. Ji-ho shook the necessary hand, said the necessary words, and then he turned back to Jade. She had taken off the tactical gloves by then. Her wine-red nails were perfect. She was always perfect. The new Phantom was waiting. The security team was larger now. She had made sure of that. They moved through the city in silence. In the back seat, he closed his eyes. Just for a moment. Just for 1 moment of stillness after a day that had been entirely without it. He felt her hand find his in the dark. And he held it, back in the penthouse, behind all the marble and glass and altitude. 2 extraordinarily composed people allowed themselves the private version of the day. The version nobody else saw. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time, looked at the cut above his brow, the bruise starting at his ribs, the torn shirt he finally dropped into the trash. And he felt, just for that 1 minute alone, the weight of it. Then he put it away, because that was who he was. He found her at the window. He always found her at the window. He put his hand on her shoulder, and she leaned back into his chest without turning, the way she had for 7 years, the way she would for every year after this. They didn't talk about it. Not tonight. Tonight was not for talking. Tonight was for the city spread out below them, indifferent and blazing. For the tea going cold in her hand, for the warm weight of each other in the dark, for sleep that finally completely came. The city below never knew what it had almost lost. The empire had not fallen. She had not let it. The next morning, Kwon Ji-ho was in the gym at 5:30. The bruise at his ribs was a deep purple green. The cut above his brow had a single small closure strip.
He trained anyway.
An hour. Every set.
No modifications.
Because that was who he was. Jade read the morning reports at her desk with her espresso and her reading glasses. The financial news showed nothing. The stock had moved normally. The board meeting was at 11. There were no disruptions in the public record of the previous day. She had managed even this. The narrative. The silence. The clean surface over the storm. The board meeting was at 11. Ji-ho chaired it with the complete authority of a man who had not yesterday been in a steel chair in an abandoned warehouse with a cut above his eye. The executives saw what they always saw, a man in full control of everything he had built. They had dinner that night in the private dining room.
Just the two of them. Candlelight. Good wine.
The kind of evening that felt entirely ordinary from the outside. She said something that made him laugh. He hadn't laughed in 24 hours. It sounded like the best thing in either of them. He watched her across the table. The wine-red dress, the candlelight on her skin, the finger waves perfect even now. And he felt something that he only allowed himself in these specific moments of specific privacy. Gratitude. Not the polite kind. The deep animal kind. The kind that has nowhere to go except held, quietly, in the chest. He raised his glass. She raised hers. No words. They didn't need them. The tower stood. The city blazed. The empire breathed. And the two people at the top of all of it went to sleep exactly as they had the night before, her hand on his chest, above his heart. Exactly where it had always been. Exactly where it would always be. Here is what the three men eventually found out. In the holding facility, weeks later, they were given access to a tablet. Routine privilege. And one of them, the strategist, because it was always the strategist, went looking. He found a photograph. The same photograph. The woman who had walked through that warehouse door. And beside it, a file. Partially redacted. Partially is the key word. Enough to see. Enough to understand. Before she was Jade Kwan. Before the penthouse and the galas and the empire. There had been 11 years of a different kind of work. Work that happened in places that don't appear on most maps. Work that the three of them, with all their capability and all their preparation and all their arrogance, would have recognized and respected deeply if they had known to look for it. They had not looked, because she was the wife. The strategist set down the tablet. He sat in the silence of that room for a very long time. And then he said, to no one in particular, simply and completely, "We never had a chance." Back in the tower, Jade was not reading any file. She was on the rooftop at golden hour with Jiho. The city spread below them in amber and violet, his arm around her waist, her head briefly on his shoulder. He said, "You didn't have to come yourself, you know." She said, "I know." He said, "Jade." She turned and looked at him. He said, "Thank you." And she looked at him, at the closure strip above his brow that was already healing, at the dragon on his neck, at the man she had chosen and been chosen by through 7 years of a life that was never simple and never boring and never, ever ordinary. And she said, "You would have done the same." "I would have," he said. And they both knew it was true. The city burned gold below them. The tower held. The empire stood. And the two people at its summit, the man who had survived the fire and the woman who had become it, turned back to the view and stayed and breathed and were exactly what they had always been to each other. Everything. Everything.